A few summers ago, I was visiting my family. I had moved out for school 3 years earlier, but I still spent the summer months there. It was about 4 months, and at some point, my parents went to visit my older sibling in another town. Because of that, I would be home alone. My family also had a cabin about a 5-hour drive away. They bought it after I moved out, so I wasn't very familiar with it. I had only been there a few times and never by myself. I asked if I could go to the cabin instead of staying home, as I thought it would be less dull. They agreed, so I left for the cabin after they headed out on a Saturday morning. I arrived in the afternoon, and there was still daylight left, so I settled in before nightfall. The cabin was pretty remote, mostly off the grid, with limited water supply. The original house, built in the 1920s, had wooden siding that made it look like a log cabin, though it wasn't one. The porch creaked, and there was a plank missing from one side. My dad was planning on making improvements, including adding a septic system, but hadn't gotten around to it. The road leading to the cabin was only for our use, so there was no reason for anyone else to be around. The road was decent as long as it didn't rain. The next day, in the afternoon, I was sitting in the living room when I heard a knock on the door. I was startled since I wasn't expecting anyone, and only my parents knew I was there. Outside stood a man I didn't recognize. He looked a little rough around the edges, but not menacing. I cracked the door open and asked what he wanted. I figured he might be a neighbor, and I didn't want to be rude. It was around 2 p.m., so I wasn't too worried. I opened the door a bit more, but kept the screen door closed. The man smiled and said he was lost and needed directions. Though it felt strange, I told him how to get back to the main road. It was a simple path, but would take him at least an hour on foot, so I didn't understand how he'd ended up here. While we talked, I noticed him glancing past me into the house, which made me uncomfortable. After a brief conversation, he turned and left, walking down the only road that led out. I watched until he disappeared. Though the encounter was odd, it didn't seem alarming enough to make a fuss over. Even though it was a remote area and there wasn't much law enforcement around, my dad had left a gun for emergencies and had shown me how to use it when we first visited. I didn't want to have to rely on it, but it gave me some comfort. That night, I was watching a movie on the old TV when I decided to step outside for a smoke. My parents didn't like me smoking inside, so I had a spot on the property I used, a small clearing by a pond. It was about 10 p.m. and dark outside, so I took a flashlight with me. When I reached the clearing, I lit up and placed the flashlight on the ground, pointing upward so I could see a bit. After a few minutes, I heard something rustling in the woods. I could tell right away it was a person. Soon, the man who had knocked on my door earlier appeared. Before I could say anything, he lunged at me. My cigarette fell to the ground, and in the scuffle, I kicked over the flashlight, leaving us mostly in the dark. The fight was chaotic, and I couldn't tell how badly I was hurt or if he had a weapon. Eventually, I managed to break free, grab my flashlight, and sprint back to the cabin. I rushed inside, unsure if he was chasing me. Once inside, I remembered the gun in the bedroom. I grabbed it, my hands trembling, unsure if it was loaded. I listened and soon heard footsteps inside the house. I yelled out that I had a gun, but there was no response, though the footsteps got closer. Suddenly, the man appeared in the doorway. I stood there shaking, pointing the gun at him. He froze when he saw it, and I shouted for him to leave. At first, he seemed like he might not, but after I warned him again, he backed off and slowly left through the front door. I kept the gun aimed at him until he vanished into the night. I collapsed onto the bed, my hands still shaking, trying to catch my breath. After a minute, I checked the gun and realized it wasn't even loaded. After pulling myself together, I grabbed my phone, keys, and wallet and left the cabin, locking the door behind me. I drove straight back to my family's house in the middle of the night. When I got home, I felt a little safer but still on edge. I called the police to report the incident and gave them the address of the cabin. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I also called my parents, who were upset and said they'd return early from their trip. I spent the rest of the night checking the locks and peeking out the windows, worried the man might have followed me. Later, the police called back and told me the cabin had been ransacked. There wasn't much of value there, but the place was a mess. They also found a campsite nearby which wasn't ours. I realized the man must have been staying on the property and waited for the chance to make a move when he saw I was alone. After that, I never felt safe there again. I'm a guy, and this took place when I was 27. My sister, Lisa, and I planned a hiking trip together. We both love the outdoors and figured it would be a great way to spend the weekend. We didn't live in the same town, but we were just about 2.5 hours apart, so meeting up wasn't too difficult. We chose a well-known trail in a nature reserve about 3 hours from my house. It was a Friday morning when we decided to go, and since her place was along my route, I decided to swing by and pick her up. By the time I got to her, it was around noon, still early enough in the day. As the urban landscape gave way to thick woods, I began to feel excited about the weekend ahead. We planned to spend 2 nights out there without following any strict schedule. The trails were vast. You could explore them for ages and not cover everything. We decided to play it by ear and just go with the flow. I had a map and a GPS with me, so we weren't totally unprepared or anything. We parked the car at a small lot which had a little building, probably some kind of visitor center, but it was empty as usual. The hike started off well. The weather was perfect, and the woods were calm. For the first few hours, we stayed in the day hiking range, so we saw other people along the way, families and older folks mostly, which sometimes slowed us down. We paused now and then to snap pictures and chat. As the sun began to set, we found a good spot to camp for the night. The next day was more of the same. We woke up early and covered a lot of ground. We chose a route we hadn't tried before, and by midday we had the trail to ourselves. We hadn't seen anyone for hours, which was exactly what we wanted. After a couple more hours of hiking, we decided to stop for a late lunch. We found a nice spot by a stream and sat down to eat. While we were resting, Lisa noticed a narrow, overgrown path branching off the main trail. Her curiosity was piqued, and she suggested we check it out. I pulled out the map, but the path wasn't on it. I walked over for a closer look, and it was definitely there, though it didn't seem to get much use. We were both intrigued, so we packed up our things and followed the small path. The deeper we went, the more overgrown it became, until it felt like we were just walking through the woods with no real trail. Occasionally, we'd spot a marker, so we weren't lost. Lisa was eager to keep exploring, and I was all for it too. After about an hour, we stumbled upon an old, run-down cabin hidden in the trees. There was a small clearing around it, and when we stepped into it, the structure loomed over us. It had clearly been abandoned for a long time. The windows were shattered, and parts of the roof were caving in. We walked around the outside, and even though the cabin was falling apart, we noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt and leaves. It was surprising given how remote we were. It seemed like we had accidentally found a spot accessible by some kind of vehicle, probably an ATV, but it still felt strange. We circled the cabin, peering through the broken windows. Inside was mostly debris and old furniture, nothing out of the ordinary, except those fresh tire tracks that kept nagging at me. Something about the whole scene made me feel like we were intruding. The place wasn't fit for anyone to live in. It looked pretty unsafe to even go inside. But despite that, both of us felt drawn to explore it further. We decided to enter through the front door. The wooden floors were soft and rotting, and everything was in disrepair. What really caught our attention, though, was a large duffel bag tucked into a corner. It was the only thing in the room that didn't look old or decayed. Lisa noticed it too. It seemed obvious that someone had stashed it there recently. Against our better judgment, we were curious. I walked over, Lisa close behind, and I unzipped the bag. The moment I saw what was inside, I knew we had to leave immediately. The bag was full of guns. I didn't inspect them closely. I zipped the bag back up quickly and told Lisa we had to run. She didn't see what was in the bag at first, so she was confused for a moment, but we left the cabin in a hurry. Once we were back in the woods, I felt a bit better, but the fear that someone might be nearby still lingered. We eventually made it back to the main trail, and only then did we feel safe again. By that point, it was getting dark, so we found a place to camp for the night. It was unsettling being so close to that cabin, but it was too late to hike out. We talked about it around the fire before bed, and it seemed pretty clear that whoever had used the cabin was likely involved in something illegal. We were lucky not to have encountered anyone there. The next morning, we packed up and hiked out quickly. It was our last day anyway. Both of us were nervous, so we barely stopped until we reached the car. When we neared the trailhead, we saw the usual families and kids, blissfully unaware of what was hidden deeper in the woods. Of course, we reported what we found to the authorities. When I followed up with the police, they said they checked the cabin but didn't find anything. That could only mean someone had returned for the bag. Lisa and I still talk about it now and then, and it never fails to give us chills. It was by far the scariest experience we've had in the wilderness. We've seen bears and other wildlife out there, but nothing compares to the danger posed by other people. On a humid late summer afternoon in Alabama, my spouse, our 5-year-old daughter, and I decided to go camping. Instead of choosing a regular camping ground, we wanted something more secluded. We had heard of an old campsite that had been shut down, no longer managed or maintained, and our curiosity got the better of us. When we arrived, we found the entrance gate to the old check-in booth chained shut. This meant we had to park our vehicle by the tree line and carry our gear in on foot. After a short walk, we began spotting remnants of old campsites, overgrown picnic tables, fire pits, and so on. We kept looking for a spot by the lake and eventually found the perfect place after a 20-minute walk from the car. That evening was peaceful, and soon our daughter was fast asleep while my spouse and I sat by the fire. The quietness was a bit unsettling. Out of nowhere, it was broken by about 5 loud, heavy footsteps from the water's edge. The sound was as if someone had just stepped out of a float in the water, followed by heavy strides onto the shore. My first thought was that maybe a park ranger or local authority had found our car, traced the campsite, and was coming to ask us to leave. But the sound didn't resemble any familiar wildlife. No deer, beaver, or even raccoons. It was much heavier, more deliberate, and strangely threatening. My usually calm and fearless spouse jumped to their feet, feeling alarmed. A chill went down my spine. We quickly grabbed a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a sturdy branch, shining the light into the trees. We stood frozen, expecting someone to approach. But no one showed up. No animal darted out. There was just silence. That's when the real fear set in. I started to believe someone dangerous might be lurking, waiting to strike. In a trembling voice, I called out, "Hello!" Just like those scenes in horror movies where you're bracing for the worst. The only response was more silence. Then we heard cracking sounds, not from the ground, but above us in the trees. Pine cones began dropping rapidly, hitting the ground in a chaotic rhythm. It was as if a swarm of squirrels had suddenly gone wild in the trees, but no matter where we aimed our flashlights, we couldn't see anything. The noises continued for what felt like forever. We stood there paralyzed, listening to the sounds from above, below, in the water, and among the trees. There was no sign of any creature. No growls, no rustling, nothing familiar at all. I felt trapped. All I wanted to do was grab our daughter, leave everything behind, and run straight to the car. But we were still a 20-minute walk away, and I couldn't bring myself to rush blindly into the dark woods with something unknown out there. Eventually, we retreated to the tent, huddling together with our daughter, waiting for something, anything to happen. The strange noises continued, echoing all around us, sometimes close, sometimes far, sometimes coming from the water, then from the trees. It was unnerving, as if we were surrounded by something that could move faster than we could track. The night dragged on with no sleep. We waited anxiously for dawn. Finally, at sunrise, the noises stopped completely. In the daylight, we cautiously approached the water's edge, looking for any sign of what could have caused those sounds. The only clue we found was a large tree trunk that had been shredded or slashed, as if attacked with a giant blade. The cuts were deep, fresh, and definitely hadn't been there the previous day. With daylight to guide us, we packed up and left, still in the dark about what had caused those eerie sounds. Maybe there was a reason that campsite had been shut down. Even years later, I haven't been able to make sense of it. It was something beyond explanation, something very unnatural. When I was 11, my dad decided we should go on a summer trip together. I was still in school, but it was July, so I had time off. My dad was usually busy with work, but he'd plan his vacation around mine so we could spend time together. Back then, I spent most of my time indoors playing video games, so my dad wanted to get me outside. That's why he rented a cabin out in the countryside, thinking it would be a good way to take me away from the TV. It was just the two of us, and the idea of being in the wilderness was exciting. I didn't mind because I liked hanging out with my dad. We drove to the cabin in my dad's work truck. He was a manager at a construction company, and they let him use the truck whenever he needed it, so it felt like his personal vehicle. The truck was pretty messy when we got in, with papers all over from his job. The drive was long, taking most of the day. We finally turned onto a dirt road that stretched about 2 or 3 miles, probably private property. On the way, we passed another vehicle. My dad waved politely, but I couldn't see who was inside. Soon, we reached the cabin. It was small, isolated, and surrounded by thick trees. Still, it was more than enough for us. One thing I remember was the small loft where I got to sleep. It was tiny and cramped, but I thought it was cool. My dad took the bedroom and I stayed in the loft. There wasn't much to the place. A small kitchen, a decent couch, and 1 bedroom. On the first day, we just wandered around and explored. My dad wanted to teach me about nature, something he hadn't done in a while, though he used to be an outdoor guide. In the evening, we tried to start a fire. My dad attempted to use a fire bow but ended up using a lighter. We cooked dinner over the fire and talked, mostly about his childhood. I felt closer to him than I had in a long time. That night, I climbed up to the loft to sleep while my dad stayed up reading on the couch. I could see him from the loft since it was open to the rest of the cabin. I struggled to fall asleep, but then I heard a soft knock on the door. It wasn't loud, but enough to get our attention. I looked down at my dad, and I could tell he heard it too. He got up and walked quietly to the door but didn't open it. He just stood there for a while, listening. After a bit, he turned off the light and sat back on the couch. Eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up, my dad was still on the couch, asleep in an upright position. I got down from the loft and walked around the cabin before waking him up. The first thing he said was that we needed to leave. I could tell something was wrong. I asked what was going on, but he told me not to worry. I figured it had to do with the knock from the night before. When we stepped outside, we saw the truck was destroyed. The tires slashed, windows broken. I asked what happened, but my dad didn't answer. He just gathered some papers from the truck and told me to stay put. We had no choice but to walk to the main road. The walk made me nervous, but my dad stayed calm. which helped me relax. We stuck to the dirt road, but I kept looking around, worried that whoever trashed the truck was still nearby. After what felt like a long time, we made it to the main road. My feet were sore, and I was exhausted, but seeing the highway was a relief. Eventually, a pickup truck came by, and my dad waved it down. The driver, an older man, stopped and offered us a ride. My dad explained the situation briefly, and the man drove us to the nearest town. At the town, the driver dropped us off at a diner, and my dad called for help. He phoned the police first and then a tow truck. While we waited, I finally asked him what had happened. He looked at me seriously and said he wasn't sure. He didn't hear anything after the knock, but he may have fallen asleep. We never spoke about it again after that. For a while, I wondered if we were targeted because of something related to my dad's work papers. But as I got older, I realized that probably wasn't the case. My dad's job wasn't that important. It was likely just a random act, possibly done by some drunk people or someone who lived nearby. We'll never know for sure, but that seems most likely.